The bus rattled down the dusty road, kicking up a cloud of dirt as it left the city far behind. Emma leaned her forehead against the window, watching the fields blur by. The weight of her decision was still sinking in. She had done it. She had finally broken free. Her parents had always planned everything for her, every decision, every move. From the clothes she wore to the people she associated with, there wasn't a part of her life they hadn't tried to control. But now, at 21, she was done living their version of her life. Financial freedom was the key to her future, and she was determined to find it, even if it meant running to a place she'd never been, doing work she wasn't sure she could handle. Emma tugged the worn flyer from her bag. Help wanted, ranch hand, room and board provided. It wasn't exactly glamorous, but she needed the job. No more relying on her parents' money, no more suffocating city life, and no more expectations. She would make her own way, even if it meant getting her hands dirty on some ranch in the middle of nowhere. The bus came to a stop at the edge of the town. She grabbed her bag, stepped off, and squinted into the afternoon sun. The air was fresher here, but hotter. And the quiet was unnerving compared to the constant hum of the city. A shiver of doubt ran through her, but she shook it off. This was her chance to prove she could do something on her own. Following the directions on the flyer, she made her way through the small town until she reached the ranch's long gravel driveway. At the end of it stood a massive, beautifully maintained ranch house that looked more like a luxury retreat than a place where animals were kept. There were barns and paddocks, and off in the distance, horses grazed in the pastures. It was grand, far more impressive than she'd imagined. As Emma approached the main building, her heart raced. She wasn't prepared for this. Was she really going to work on a ranch? But before she could dwell on her nerves, a deep voice snapped her back to the present. "Are you lost?" Emma turned to see him, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a fitted black t-shirt and worn jeans, his arms crossed over his chest. His sharp features were framed by messy, dark hair, and his eyes narrowed as they scanned her up and down. There was no warmth in his gaze, only irritation. "I'm here about the job," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. His eyes flicked to her small suitcase, then back to her. A faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You don't look like you belong here." Emma's jaw clenched. She had faced condescending men before, but there was something particularly infuriating about this one. His arrogance was palpable. "I can work," she shot back, her voice firm. "I just need a chance." The man raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. "I'm Liam. I run this place. Follow me." And just like that, her new life began.
Liam watched as Emma dragged her suitcase behind her, kicking up dust as she made her way toward him. His first thought was simple. Trouble. She didn't belong here. Her clothes, her demeanor, the way she held herself. It all screamed city girl, and nothing about her seemed cut out for the rough, unforgiving work of a ranch. He wasn't sure what had possessed her to think she could handle it, but he could already tell she wouldn't last. She introduced herself, Emma, with a spark of defiance in her eyes, and that caught him off guard. Most people who came here looking for work either groveled for the job or walked away the moment they saw what was expected of them, but she stood tall, chin up, and there was a determination in her voice he hadn't expected. Still, determination didn't mean much when it came to ranch work. She'd learned that soon enough. He couldn't shake the sense of irritation bubbling inside him. He didn't have time for this. The ranch was his life, his responsibility. And it was more than just some quaint family farm. The luxury hotel and restaurant they'd built were a part of his vision, an expansion of what his father had started. People came from all over to stay here, drawn in by the scenic views and high-end experiences, and he prided himself on keeping everything running smoothly. Every minute spent dealing with Emma was a distraction from that. "Are you sure you know what you're getting into?" he asked, narrowing his eyes at her. She had guts to show up here, but guts wouldn't be enough. "Ranch work isn't for everyone." "I can handle it," she replied quickly, as if daring him to challenge her. He almost smirked at her confidence, but instead, his jaw tightened. He'd seen enough greenhorns come and go. They always thought they could hack it, but they never lasted more than a week. Her clothes were too clean, her hands too soft. The city still clung to her like a perfume she couldn't shake. But something about the fire in her eyes made him hold his tongue. He would give her a chance, even if he was sure she'd be gone before the week was out. She was determined to prove something, but so was he. "Fine," he said gruffly, turning his back to her and motioning for her to follow. "You'll start with the horses, mucking out the stables. Then we'll see if you can manage something more challenging." He wasn't about to go easy on her. If she was serious, she'd learn the hard way. If she wasn't, well, he wouldn't have to deal with her for long. As they walked toward the stables, he kept his eyes straight ahead, his thoughts already shifting back to the endless list of tasks waiting for him. This was just a minor inconvenience, a temporary distraction. There was no way a girl like her was sticking around for long. He'd see her off soon enough, but even as he thought that, he couldn't help but wonder why. Despite his irritation, something about her had left a mark.
Emma's arms ached as she struggled to push the wheelbarrow across the uneven ground. Her boots, already caked in mud, slipped as she wrestled with the heavy load. Mucking out the stables was harder than she'd imagined, and the blistering sun beating down on her didn't help. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but she gritted her teeth and kept going. Liam had made it clear that he didn't expect her to last. From the moment she'd arrived, his cold demeanor had spoken volumes. He barely acknowledged her presence beyond giving her orders, and when he did, it was always with that same dismissive look in his eyes, like he was just waiting for her to quit. But Emma had no intention of quitting. She hadn't come all this way to give up after a few blisters and bruises. She needed this job. More than that, she needed to prove to herself and to Liam that she could do it. She'd spent too many years being told what she couldn't do, being sheltered and controlled by her parents. Here, at least, she had control over her own choices. Her hands shook as she grabbed the pitchfork and kept working, sweat trickling down her forehead. Liam wasn't making it easy. He watched her with those piercing eyes, never offering a word of encouragement or even a nod of approval. It was like he was silently daring her to fail. What frustrated her the most was that despite his infuriating attitude, she couldn't ignore how attractive he was. Every time he stalked past, his broad shoulders and confident stride caught her attention. There was something about the way he carried himself, completely at ease with his surroundings, that drew her in, even though she wished it didn't. His arrogance and coldness should have made him repulsive, but instead it made him intriguing. She hated that about herself. Focus, Emma, she reminded herself, stabbing the pitchfork into the hay with more force than necessary. As the day wore on, she felt exhaustion creeping up on her. She wasn't used to this kind of labor, and Liam's constant indifference only made it worse. By the time she saw him striding toward her again, the irritation boiling inside her was hard to contain. "You missed a spot," Liam said coolly, pointing at a pile of hay she hadn't cleared. Emma stopped, straightening up, her heart pounding from more than just the hard work. She was tired, frustrated, and fed up with his smug attitude. Before she could stop herself, the words spilled out. "If you think you can do it better, why don't you show me?" She shot back, surprising even herself with her boldness. Liam froze, his eyes narrowing as if he hadn't expected her to talk back. For a moment, neither of them moved, tension crackling in the air between them. Emma held his gaze, her chest heaving with defiance. A slow, almost amused smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Maybe you're not as soft as I thought," he said, his voice low. Emma wasn't sure if that was a compliment, but something told her she had just won a small victory.
Liam leaned against the fence post, arms crossed, watching Emma struggle with the horses. It had been days now, and to his surprise, she hadn't quit. Most people in her shoes, soft city types, would have walked off by now, too tired or too proud to keep at it, but not Emma. She wasn't good at the work, at least not yet. She fumbled with the tack, took twice as long as the other ranch hands to complete basic tasks, and often wore a frustrated look that made him think she was on the verge of giving up. But she didn't. Every day she showed up early, dirt smudged on her clothes, with that same stubborn fire in her eyes. He was annoyed, no question about it. He had enough on his plate without having to babysit someone with no experience. Still, as much as he wanted to dismiss her as just another fleeting distraction, he couldn't quite do it. There was something about the way she kept pushing through, despite her struggles, despite his cold treatment, that got under his skin. At first, he had written her off as another city girl looking for an adventure, someone who would pack up and leave the second things got too real. But the more he watched her, the harder that became to believe. She wasn't just here for fun. She was really trying to make this work. And that determination, it was impossible not to notice. Liam shifted his weight, his eyes narrowing as he watched her lead one of the horses into the barn. The animal had been spooked earlier, but Emma had handled it better than he'd expected. She was learning. He had to give her that. Not that he was about to admit it out loud. Still, there was something else, something beneath the surface that had been nagging at him lately. He wasn't just annoyed with her, that was part of it, sure, but there was something else too, curiosity. He found himself wondering about her more than he should. Why had she really come here? What was she running from? She never talked about her past, and Liam didn't ask, but that didn't stop his mind from wandering. There was a mystery to her that he hadn't anticipated, and it bothered him more than he liked. And then there was the other thing, something he tried to shove down every time it surfaced. Attraction. It was ridiculous. She wasn't his type. He preferred women who knew the ranch life, who weren't so frustratingly hard to read, but every time he caught a glimpse of her fiery determination, something inside him stirred. He couldn't help but notice the way she stood up to him, the way she refused to back down. He quickly shook the thought away, clenching his jaw. He had no time for this. Emma was here to work, nothing more, and he was her boss. End of story. But even as he tried to convince himself, he knew it wasn't that simple. Something had shifted, and ignoring it was becoming harder by the day.
The mornings were still hard, but they didn't feel as impossible anymore. Emma wiped her forehead with the back of her hand and looked out over the pasture, a sense of accomplishment settling in her chest. It had taken time, more than she'd expected, but she was starting to get the hang of things. The muscles in her arms didn't burn as much as they had at the beginning, and her hands had begun to toughen from all the manual work. She was no longer fumbling through tasks, and for once she felt like she was earning her place here. The other workers had warmed to her as well. At first they had seemed wary of this city girl, but over time they'd started treating her like one of their own. She joked with them during breaks, learning about their lives and families, and they even began to offer her tips on how to improve. Whether it was teaching her how to handle the horses more efficiently or showing her a better way to stack hay, the camaraderie made her feel like she was finally part of the team. It was Liam, though, who remained a mystery. He was still distant, keeping to himself most of the time, but there were moments when she caught glimpses of something deeper beneath his tough exterior. When he thought no one was watching, she saw how gentle he could be with the horses, the way his voice softened when he talked to them, how his rough hands became careful and kind. And then there was the restaurant. One evening as she finished up work, she wandered over to the main house where the ranch's luxury restaurant was located. She hadn't seen much of it before, but tonight she caught sight of Liam inside, his expression focused as he spoke with the chef and waitstaff. It was a side of him she hadn't seen yet, professional, calm, and surprisingly charming. He wasn't barking orders or grumbling. He was in his element, effortlessly running things with a quiet confidence that was almost appealing. Her heart skipped a beat as she watched him from the doorway. Was this the same man who barely spoke to her during the day? The same man who seemed to regard her with irritation most of the time? She was starting to see layers to him, and it confused her. The next day, her observations of him took on a new weight. As they passed in the barn, Liam paused for just a moment, watching as she struggled with a saddle. Without a word, he stepped forward, fixing the strap she'd been fumbling with. His hands worked quickly, efficiently, and when he stepped back, their eyes met for a fleeting second. "There," he said gruffly. "That should hold." It wasn't much, just a few words and a simple action, but something about it stayed with her. Maybe it was the way his tone lacked its usual edge, or how he hadn't immediately criticized her for getting it wrong. For the first time, she wondered if there was more to Liam than the gruff exterior he wore like armor. As she worked through the rest of the day, the thought lingered in the back of her mind. Liam wasn't just the harsh, cold man she'd thought. He was something else, something more, and now she was starting to see it.
Jealousy creeps in. Liam notices how the other men on the ranch are starting to pay attention to Emma, and it irritates him more than he expected. He tells himself it's because she's a distraction, but the truth is he's starting to feel protective. The sound of laughter echoed through the ranch, drawing Liam's attention toward the stables. There he saw her, Emma, smiling brightly among the ranch hands, and he couldn't ignore the sudden knot that formed in his chest. It was uncomfortable, unfamiliar, a feeling he tried to rationalize as annoyance. But deep down he knew it was more. Her laughter filled the air again, light and carefree, and the men around her chuckled along, clearly enjoying her presence. Liam's grip tightened around the pitchfork he was holding. He should be happy that Emma was getting along with everyone, that she was settling into the ranch life. But as he watched her exchange playful banter with one of the younger ranch hands, all he felt was an overwhelming sense of irritation. He'd known from the start that she would bring trouble. He just hadn't anticipated it would be this kind. The more time he spent around her, the harder it became to deny the way she was worming her way. under his skin. Her stubborn determination, her willingness to learn, they were things he admired, even if he didn't want to. And now, watching the easy way she interacted with the others, Liam couldn't ignore the unwelcome spark of jealousy that flared within him. It was ridiculous, really. He had no claim over Emma, no right to feel anything other than professional interest. Yet, as her laughter rang out again, something inside him snapped. He strode over to where she stood, his voice coming out gruffer than intended. "Emma," he said, his tone all business, "I need you to check on the mare in stable 3. She's due any day now, and we can't afford any complications." The words were harsh, colder than he'd meant them to be, but he couldn't take them back. Instead, he watched as her smile faltered, confusion replacing the joy in her eyes. "Right away," she replied, turning to head toward the stable. Liam ignored the questioning glances from the ranch hands, choosing instead to focus on getting back to work. But even as he threw himself into his tasks, his thoughts remained on Emma, on the way she'd laughed with the others, on the way she'd looked at him with those clear, questioning eyes. He pushed himself harder, trying to outrun the unwelcome emotions that were bubbling beneath the surface. Jealousy was a luxury he couldn't afford, and giving in to his growing feelings was out of the question. He had to keep his distance, had to keep his emotions in check, no matter how much it bothered him to see Emma smiling at anyone other than him.
The shift in Liam's behavior was subtle at first, but Emma felt it. He pushed her harder now more than before. His criticism was sharper, his orders more direct, and every time she thought she was making progress, he found something to correct. It was infuriating, and yet there was something else simmering beneath the surface, something she couldn't quite put into words. The tension between them was undeniable. It hung in the air whenever they were close, crackling like a live wire. She had noticed it the most during their brief exchanges. His gaze lingered longer, and his tone, though still curt, had a weight to it that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just her frustration or his constant scrutiny. There was something more, and it was growing stronger every day. It both excited and confused her. One afternoon, after hours of working in the blistering sun, Liam found her in the barn, struggling with a stubborn piece of equipment. Sweat dripped from her forehead as she muttered under her breath, trying to fix the latch on the gate. She could feel his eyes on her before he spoke. "You're doing it wrong," he said flatly, stepping closer. Emma's patience snapped. She turned to him, the heat of the day and the constant pressure of his presence fueling her irritation. "Why don't you just say that about everything I do, Liam? Because apparently I can't do anything right." He raised an eyebrow, his posture tense. "Maybe if you listened the first time—" "I do listen," she cut him off, her voice sharp. "But you don't give anyone a chance. You expect perfection from day one and then act surprised when people can't read your mind." Liam took a step closer, his face tightening. "This isn't about reading minds. It's about not making careless mistakes. One wrong move around here and someone could get hurt, including you." She glared at him, not backing down. "Maybe if you stopped treating everyone like they're incompetent, you'd realize some of us are trying, Liam." The silence between them was thick. Neither moved. His eyes were locked on hers, and for the first time she saw something raw beneath the surface, something more than just frustration. She could feel the heat of his presence, the tension between them pulling tighter. His voice softened just a fraction, and the shift in his tone caught her off guard. "I can't afford mistakes, Emma." Her breath hitched. His words hung in the air, but it wasn't the words that got to her. It was the way he looked at her, like he was fighting something inside himself. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she couldn't tell if it was from anger or something else entirely. For a second, it felt like the world had narrowed down to just the two of them. The barn, the heat, the endless demands of the ranch, it all fell away. All that remained was the crackling intensity between them. Emma swallowed, taking a step back, breaking the moment. Her pulse raced as she turned away, confusion swirling inside her. What was this between them? And why, despite everything, did she feel so drawn to it? Whatever it was, she knew one thing for sure: this wasn't just about work anymore.
Liam ran a hand through his hair, the sun already sinking low over the horizon as the day dragged to its end. It had been a long, exhausting day, filled with complications that put everyone on edge. But it wasn't the endless stream of work that was bothering him. It was her. Emma. He couldn't get her out of his head. No matter how much he tried to focus on the ranch, on the business, every time she crossed his path, his mind clouded with thoughts he didn't want to acknowledge. She was more than just an employee now. Somehow, she had wormed her way past his defenses. He was drawn to her, and it frustrated him more than anything. Liam stood in the barn, watching the horses settle in for the evening. His thoughts swirled, and the more he tried to shake them, the worse it got. The way she looked at him when she was angry, fire in her eyes, that stubborn set to her jaw, kept replaying in his mind. He had always been able to keep his emotions in check, to keep everyone at a distance, but Emma, she was breaking down those walls piece by piece. The creak of the barn door pulled him from his thoughts. Emma stepped inside, her movements hesitant, like she wasn't sure what kind of mood he'd be in. She was always cautious around him now, and he couldn't blame her. He had been hard on her. Harder than on anyone else, but not because she deserved it. It was because he couldn't figure out what to do with how she made him feel. "Liam," she called softly, her voice barely cutting through the quiet. He turned, and for a moment they just stood there, staring at each other. The tension between them was thick, heavier than it had ever been. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he watched her, the way her chest rose and fell as if she too was fighting some invisible battle. Emma stepped closer, her eyes searching his face for answers he didn't have. He could feel the magnetic pull between them, stronger than it had ever been. She was too close now, and yet not close enough. His heart pounded in his chest, and all he wanted in that moment was to close the distance between them. Without thinking, his hand reached out, his fingers grazing her arm. She shivered at the contact, and he saw the flicker of something in her eyes, surprise maybe, or something more. His breath caught as they stood there, so close now that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. He leaned in, the pull between them impossible to resist. For a split second, their lips were almost touching. And then he stopped. Liam pulled back abruptly, clenching his fists at his sides, trying to shove down the feelings surging through him. He couldn't let this happen. He wouldn't. If he let himself give in, he would lose control, and losing control wasn't something he could afford. Emma's eyes widened, confusion and hurt flashing across her face as he stepped away. He cursed himself under his breath, frustrated beyond belief. He had to keep his distance. She was dangerous, dangerous in a way that terrified him, because with Emma, he wasn't sure he could stay in control much longer.
Emma couldn't stop thinking about it. The moment in the barn, the way Liam had been so close, his breath warm against her skin, and then how he'd pulled away, like he was fighting some battle within himself. The intensity of it haunted her. She had spent the entire night tossing and turning, unable to shake the tension that had built between them. She was confused. She had never felt this way before. Liam was cold, distant, infuriating at times, and yet there was something about him that kept drawing her in. She tried to convince herself that it didn't matter, that it was just a passing attraction, but deep down, she knew it was more. Every time he looked at her, every time their arguments turned heated, there was a spark between them she couldn't ignore. But it terrified her. She was scared of letting him get close, of getting hurt. She had been hurt before, by people who were supposed to care for her, and she wasn't sure she could take that risk again. The walls she had built around herself weren't easy to break down. Yet, despite all of that, she found herself walking toward the barn again, her steps heavier with each passing second. She needed answers. She needed to understand why he had pulled away, why he was always so hot and cold with her. And, if she was being honest with herself, she needed to understand her own feelings too. When she entered the barn, Liam was already there, grooming one of the horses. His back was to her, but as she stepped inside, he turned, his eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "Emma," he said, his voice low and rough, like he had been thinking about her too. Her heart raced. The air between them felt charged, like the tension from the night before had only grown stronger. She crossed her arms, trying to steady her breath. "What happened last night?" Liam didn't answer right away. He set down the brush and took a step toward her, his jaw tight. "It was a mistake." The words hit her harder than she expected, like a cold slap to the face. "A mistake?" she repeated, her voice cracking. "That's what you think this is?" Liam's eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw the conflict there, the way he was fighting something inside himself. "Yes," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. The frustration boiled over. Emma took a step forward, her voice trembling with emotion. "You're lying." Before she could stop herself, she closed the distance between them, her hands reaching for him, pulling him toward her, and then, like a dam breaking, all the tension, all the emotions they'd been holding back came crashing down. Their lips met, and the kiss was electric, filled with the passion they had both been suppressing for too long. For a moment, Nothing else existed. It was just them, the heat of the kiss, the intensity of their connection. But as quickly as it started, reality rushed back in. Emma pulled away, her heart pounding, her mind spinning. She stared at Liam, her breath coming in short gasps, terrified of what she had just done. Liam's face was unreadable, his eyes dark and conflicted. He didn't move, didn't say anything, and the silence between them was deafening. She backed away slowly, her hands trembling. I shouldn't have done that. But the truth was, she wasn't sure what scared her more, that she had crossed the line or that she didn't regret it.
Liam couldn't shake the image of Emma, the feel of her lips against his, the way she'd pulled him close, the fire that had ignited between them. It had been hours since that kiss, and yet it replayed in his mind like a loop he couldn't escape. Every thought, every movement was consumed by her, and that terrified him. That he hadn't wanted this. He hadn't wanted to feel anything for her. She was supposed to be just another worker, another fleeting presence on the ranch. But now she had become something else. Something he couldn't control. The worst part was the way it twisted inside him. The possessiveness. He hated the thought of her with anyone else. Every time she so much as spoke to one of the other ranch hands, his stomach churned with a jealousy he couldn't explain. He had no right to feel this way. Emma wasn't his. But that logic didn't stop the sharp stab of anger that rose every time someone got too close to her. Liam caught sight of her the next morning, laughing with one of the younger workers, Ben. Ben was always hanging around her, helping her with small tasks and making easy conversation. A sour taste filled Liam's mouth as he watched from a distance. The jealousy crept in, hot and suffocating, curling tight in his chest. Emma glanced in his direction and their eyes met. For a second he saw something flicker in her expression, maybe confusion, maybe hesitation, but she quickly turned back to Ben. Liam's fists clenched at his sides, and he had to physically restrain himself from marching over and pulling her away. What is wrong with me? He thought. Fury building inside. He had always prided himself on being in control, on keeping his emotions tightly locked away, but with Emma, that control was slipping, unraveling piece by piece. Later that day, when he caught her alone near the stables, the words were out of his mouth before he could stop them. You spend a lot of time with Ben, he said, his voice tight, betraying the storm of emotions beneath the surface. Emma blinked, surprised by his tone. What? Ben's just being nice. We're friends. Liam's jaw tensed. Friends. The word grated against his nerves. He stepped closer, the possessiveness surging again. You need to focus on your work, not on making friends. Her eyes narrowed. What is that supposed to mean? I'm working, Liam. I can handle both. He didn't know how to explain it, how to tell her that the thought of her being close to anyone else was driving him mad. Instead, the words came out harsher than he intended. I don't need distractions on my ranch. Emma crossed her arms, clearly frustrated. Is that what I am? A distraction? Liam's throat tightened. He hadn't meant it like that, not exactly, but the anger and jealousy had already clouded his judgment. He was losing control, and he hated it. He hated that Emma had this power over him, that she could unravel him with a look, a laugh, a kiss. I don't want you with anyone else, he blurted, his voice rough, the vulnerability slipping out before he could stop it. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma stared at him, wide-eyed, as if trying to make sense of his words. And in that moment, Liam realized just how deep he had sunk into this mess. He was falling for her, and it was scaring him to death.
Emma paced the length of her small room, her mind spinning with everything that had happened. The kiss, the possessiveness in Liam's voice, the way he had practically told her he didn't want anyone else near her, it was all too much. She had come to the ranch to escape control, to build her own life, her own freedom. And yet here she was, feeling like she was teetering on the edge of losing herself again. She had felt it with her parents, how they had suffocated her with their rules, their constant expectations. Every decision had been theirs, every moment of her life dictated by their idea of what was right for her. Running from that had been the hardest thing she'd ever done, and now, standing at this strange crossroads with Liam, she could feel a similar weight bearing down on her, but this time it was different. This time, it was her heart that was tangled up in it all. She cared for Liam. She couldn't deny that anymore. The kiss had opened something inside her she hadn't been ready to face, but falling for him didn't mean she was willing to give up her independence. She couldn't lose herself again, not for anyone. With a steadying breath, Emma made her way toward the barn, where she knew Liam would be. The conversation ahead filled her with dread, but she knew it was necessary. If she didn't confront him now, things would spiral out of control, and she wouldn't let that happen. Not again. She found Liam standing by the paddock, his back to her as he tended to one of the horses. He didn't notice her approach, but when she called his name, he stiffened and turned, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," she said, crossing her arms, her resolve hardening. Liam nodded once, his face tightening, as if he knew this conversation was coming. "What is it?" Emma took a deep breath, her words coming faster than she had planned. Whatever this is between us, I can't let it become something that controls me. I left my entire life behind because I couldn't breathe under someone else's expectations, and now I'm afraid it's happening again. Liam frowned, his brows furrowing in confusion. "You think I'm trying to control you?" "Yes," she said, her voice firm, though her heart ached at the admission. "You can't stand the idea of me talking to anyone else, working with anyone else, and I get it, Liam. You're scared. But so am I. I'm scared of falling for you and losing the independence I fought so hard for." He stepped closer, but she held up her hand, stopping him. "No, you need to hear me. I won't stay here if you keep acting like you own me. I won't trade one cage for another, even if this one feels like something I want." Liam's face softened, the harsh lines of his jaw easing as her words hit him. He took a step back, his hands falling to his sides. "Emma, No," she cut in gently. "I need you to understand that I'm not someone you can possess. If we're going to figure this out, I need to be free to make my own choices. I need to be me, not just someone who fits into your world." The silence between them stretched, heavy and uncertain. Emma's heart pounded, terrified of what his answer might be. She had to be willing to walk away, even if it hurt. Finally, Liam spoke, his voice low and thick with emotion. "You're right. I don't want to control you, but I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to let someone in without being afraid of losing them." Emma's heart softened at his vulnerability, but she stayed firm. "Then figure it out, Liam, because I can't stay if this is how it's going to be." He nodded slowly, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet understanding. "I'll try."
Liam sat alone in the barn, the soft sounds of the horses shifting in their stalls the only noise around him. Emma's words played over and over in his mind. He couldn't shake them. She was right, and he hated that she was. He had been trying to control her, trying to keep her close in the only way he knew how, by pushing her away from anyone else, and in doing so, he was driving her away from him. He ran his hands over his face, feeling the weight of the moment press down on him. It wasn't just about Emma, it was about the walls he'd built, the ones that had kept him safe for years, but those walls were also keeping her out. If he didn't change, if he didn't let those walls down, he would lose her. And the thought of that, losing Emma, was more terrifying than anything else. He had been hurt before. That much was true. His need for control, for distance, all stemmed from the fear that if he let someone get too close, they'd leave. It had happened before, and the wounds were still fresh, even if he had buried them deep. The people he had let in before had either betrayed his trust or left him when things got tough. It was easier to be alone, easier to keep people at arm's length than risk that kind of pain again. But Emma was different. She was fiery, stubborn, and maddeningly independent. And she was also everything he didn't know he needed. The thought of losing her because of his own fears made him feel sick. He had to face the truth. He couldn't control this. He couldn't control her. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to. That evening, Liam found Emma near the stables, brushing down one of the horses. Her movements were slow, methodical, but her face was distant, her mind clearly elsewhere. He approached her cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest, unsure of how to start. "Emma," he said quietly. She turned to face him, her expression guarded, waiting for what he had to say. He could see the hurt in her eyes, the uncertainty. "I've been pushing you away," he began, his voice rough. "Because I'm scared. I've been trying to control things, trying to keep myself from getting hurt again. But in doing that, I've hurt you instead. And that's the last thing I wanted." Her eyes softened, but she didn't speak, waiting for him to continue. I've been hurt before," he admitted, the words coming out slowly, as if they had been locked away for too long. "People I cared about left when I needed them. It made me think that if I didn't control things, I'd lose them. But I see now that trying to control you, to keep you from being yourself, is the worst thing I could have done." Emma's gaze never left his, and Liam felt his walls cracking, pieces of his past spilling out that he had never shared with anyone before. "I'm falling for you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "and it scares the hell out of me. But I don't want to lose you, Emma. I know I have to change. I want to give you the freedom you need, the space to be who you are. You deserve that." She looked at him, her eyes glistening with something he couldn't quite read. For the first time in a long time, he felt vulnerable, exposed. But maybe that was what he needed. Liam took a step closer, his heart in his throat. "I don't know how to do this perfectly, but I'll try. For you, I just don't want to lose you." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air thick with emotion. Then, slowly, Emma nodded, her voice soft. "I don't want to lose you either." And just like that, something between them shifted. The walls had come down, and for the first time, Liam felt like maybe they could build something real together.
Emma stood there, heart racing, Liam's confession still hanging in the air between them. His words had cracked something open inside her, something she had been holding on to so tightly. Her fear. The vulnerability he had shown was something she hadn't expected from him, and it moved her in a way she wasn't prepared for. But it also terrified her. She had always fought for her freedom, her independence. It had taken everything in her to break away from the life her parents had crafted for her, and the idea of letting someone in, of risking her heart, felt like she was teetering on the edge of losing herself again. Liam had made it clear that he didn't want to control her, but could she really trust that? Could she let go of the armor she'd built around her heart? Her instinct was to run, to protect herself. But something in Liam's eyes kept her rooted in place. He was offering her more than just his affection. He was offering her a chance to build something real, something they could create together. It wasn't about him taking her freedom. It was about learning to share their lives without losing themselves in the process. Still, the doubt gnawed at her. What if she let herself fall for him and things didn't work out? What if she lost herself in the process? She had never depended on anyone before. Not in this way. But deep down, Emma knew that love was a risk. It was about trusting someone not to hurt you, even when you were at your most vulnerable. And Liam had shown her his vulnerability, had opened up in a way she hadn't expected. Could she do the same? Emma took a deep breath, her thoughts swirling, but something inside her shifted. She realized that the fear wasn't as paralyzing as it used to be. She had already proven she could stand on her own 2 feet, that she could make her own way. And now, maybe it was time to take a chance on something more, something bigger than just herself. "I'm scared too," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "I've never let anyone in like this before. I don't know how to depend on someone else, not without feeling like I'm losing myself." Liam didn't interrupt. He just listened, his eyes steady and focused on hers. "But maybe love isn't about losing yourself. Maybe it's about finding someone who helps you stay grounded while you grow," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "And I think I want to take that chance with you." The relief in Liam's eyes was immediate, but there was something deeper there too, something that told her he understood the gravity of her words. She wasn't giving up her freedom, she was choosing to share it with him. Their relationship began to shift from that moment on. It wasn't perfect, and Emma still wrestled with her fears, but they were learning to trust each other. Liam gave her the space she needed, while Emma allowed herself to be more vulnerable, slowly letting him see the parts of her that she had kept hidden. Each day, their bond deepened. They spent more time together, sometimes working in silence, other times talking late into the night about their lives, their dreams, and their fears. It wasn't about control or dependency. It was about building something new, something they both wanted. For the first time in her life, Emma felt like she wasn't running. She was standing still, letting herself be seen, letting herself be loved, and that was the biggest risk of all. But this time, she was willing to take it.
Liam had never felt anything like this before. The relief that washed over him after Emma said she was willing to take a chance on him was overwhelming, but it was more than just relief. It was hope. For the first time in a long while, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could have something real. But he knew it wouldn't be easy. Emma had made it clear that she valued her independence, and he wasn't about to take that from her. If he wanted this to work, he'd have to be better. He'd have to prove he could be the partner she needed. The thought settled deep inside him. He would do whatever it took to make this work. Over the next few days, Liam found himself being more aware of his actions, especially when it came to Emma. He gave her space, but he made sure she knew he was there for her, that he had her back. It was a balance, and he was determined to get it right whenever she struggled with something on the ranch. He'd step in, not to take over, but to show her new ways to handle the work. He was learning, too. Learning how to be open with her, to share more of himself than he ever had with anyone else. There were still moments when the old instincts flared up, when he felt the urge to protect her in ways that bordered on possessive. But he was getting better at stopping himself, reminding himself that Emma didn't need to be coddled. She needed to be trusted. One afternoon, they worked together on fixing a broken fence at the far end of the property. The sun was hot, the work tiring, but there was an ease between them that hadn't been there before. Emma worked alongside him, her movements confident, her gaze steady. Every now and then she'd glance over at him with a smile, and it warmed him in ways he hadn't expected. "You're getting better at this," Liam said, nodding toward the fence she'd nearly finished repairing. Emma wiped sweat from her brow and grinned. "I had a good teacher," Liam chuckled, but there was more to it than just pride in her work. He was proud of the way their relationship was growing, of how far they'd both come. He had spent so long shutting people out, convinced that staying closed off was the only way to protect himself. But with Emma, he was learning that vulnerability wasn't a weakness. It was what allowed them to truly connect. Later, when the work was done, they sat together on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was quiet, save for the soft sounds of the ranch settling into the evening. Liam turned to Emma, his heart full, the words coming easier now. "I know I've made mistakes," he said quietly. "I'm not perfect, and I know we've got challenges ahead, but I'm here. I'm going to keep showing up for you, for us." Emma looked at him, her eyes soft but steady. "I don't expect perfect, Liam. I just need you to keep trying, to keep trusting me, and to let me be me." He nodded, reaching for her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath his. "I can do that. I want to do that." They stayed like that for a long while, their hands intertwined, the weight of their past slowly lifting as they healed together. It wasn't always going to be easy, Liam knew that, but as long as they worked side by side, both on the ranch and in their relationship, they had a chance to build something strong, something lasting, and for the first time in his life, Liam knew that was exactly what he wanted.
The air was crisp, the kind of clear morning that made everything feel alive. Emma stood on the hill overlooking the ranch, her arms wrapped around herself as she watched the sun climb higher into the sky. The view below, the rolling fields, the horses grazing in the distance, was peaceful. But it wasn't just the ranch that filled her with contentment. It was the knowledge that she had built something here, not just in this place, but within herself. She had come to the ranch looking for freedom, running from the suffocating grip of her parents and the life they'd tried to impose on her. And in a way, she'd found that freedom, but it wasn't the kind she'd expected. Instead of finding it in isolation or total independence, she had discovered it in something far more profound. Balance. She was free because she was finally being true to herself, living the life she wanted with someone who respected her need for independence but loved her fiercely too. Liam. She smiled softly at the thought of him. Their relationship hadn't been easy, far from it. There had been moments when she thought they wouldn't make it, when the weight of their pasts had threatened to pull them apart, but they had fought for this, together. And now, standing here, Emma realized just how far they had both come. The sound of footsteps approaching pulled her from her thoughts. Liam walked up the hill, his expression relaxed, but with that familiar intensity in his eyes. When he reached her, he slid his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "Morning," he said, his voice warm and low. "Morning," she replied, leaning into him, feeling the strength and comfort of his presence. They stood in silence for a moment, taking in the view, the stillness between them filled with unspoken understanding. This was their life now, and it felt right in a way Emma had never imagined possible. "I was thinking," Liam started, his voice softer now, "about what you said about the future. We've built something here, but it's just the beginning, I want to keep building it with you." Emma looked up at him, her heart swelling at his words. It wasn't just about the ranch or the life they'd created here. It was about them, the way they had learned to trust, to love, and to let each other be who they truly were. "I want that too," she said, her voice steady and sure. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want to face it with you." Liam's gaze softened, his hand reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her face. "I love you, Emma." She smiled, her heart light as she responded. "I love you too." He leaned down, their lips meeting in a kiss that felt like a promise, one of love, respect, and partnership. It was a kiss that sealed the commitment they had already made to each other, unspoken but deeply understood. As they pulled apart, Emma rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. The future stretched out before them, full of possibilities, but for the first time she wasn't afraid of it. She wasn't running anymore. Together they had created something real, something that was theirs. Emma glanced out at the ranch, at the life they had built from the ground up, and felt a deep sense of peace. This was her new beginning, and this time it wasn't about escaping. It was about choosing. And for the first time, Emma felt completely, undeniably free.